Welcome back to the channel where history gets darker, weirder, and a little bit sarcastic. If you love forbidden royal scandals, bizarre medieval rituals, and creepy truths that school never told you, hit that subscribe button now so you won't miss the next nightmare from history. Let's get right into it. Number 1. Beauty auctions for the rich. Imagine your entire value being determined in a village talent show. Except instead of singing, you're paraded half-naked while rich men bid on your body. Welcome to the ancient and medieval practice of peasant girl auctions. In Mesopotamia, according to the historian Herodotus, the marriage market was less like a meet cute and more like a cattle sale with boobs. The so-called pretty ones were auctioned to the highest bidder, while the less desired women had to literally come with a dowry attached, meaning men were paid to take them away. Romantic, right? This wasn't just ancient Mesopotamia, though. Medieval Europe wasn't shy about treating peasant girls as living currency. Families crushed by famine or taxes would sell off daughters to noblemen, monasteries, or outright slave traders. The nobility got cheap concubines, while peasants got just enough coin to avoid starving for another week. Basically, it was DoorDash for human misery. The irony? Chronicles often tried to spin this as a form of charity or a social balance, like, don't worry, we're saving these poor girls from poverty by giving them to old barons with gout and wandering hands. Yeah, thanks, society. Basically, history had its own twisted version of The Bachelor, except instead of roses, you got branded as property. Number 2. The rite of the first night. Picture this. You finally get married after years of farm work. Your bride is trembling with nerves, and then, oh, surprise! Your feudal lord strolls in claiming it's his turn first. This creepy legend is known as Jus Primae Noctis, or the rite of the first night. Now, historians argue about how often it really happened, but the fact it was even rumored tells you how messed up things were. The idea was simple. When peasant girls married, the local noble could demand to sleep with them before their husbands ever got the chance. Real life Netflix and chill, except the Netflix is feudal oppression, and the chill is pure terror. Even if it wasn't universally practiced, the threat was enough. Imagine your wedding being overshadowed by the looming possibility of your lord crashing the honeymoon. Reinforced one ugly truth. Your wife's body wasn't yours or even hers. It belonged to the man who owned your land. It was the ultimate delete husband, insert baron kind of deal. So whether it was an actual custom or a psychological weapon of fear, it worked brilliantly as control. Nothing screams your property louder than the fear that your wedding night might come with a guest star. Basically, it was the medieval version of malware. Nobody's totally sure how many people actually got infected, but everyone was terrified of it anyway. Number 3. Brides by taxation. Imagine if instead of paying your landlord in cash, you had to pay in daughters. Welcome to medieval bride tax schemes where nobles demanded peasant families offer up young women as part of their feudal dues. Can't cough up enough wheat? No problem. Oh, your daughter's virginity will cover the debt. Chroniclers across Europe whispered about these practices, though the church loved to pretend it wasn't happening under their noses. Nobles kept harems of peasant girls in fortified castles, dressed them up in silks they could never afford, then discarded them once they were pregnant or no longer useful. And here's the kicker. These women often had no way back. Shamed by their villages, abandoned by their families, they were now stuck in a limbo between slave, mistress, and discarded trash. The irony? Some nobles claimed they were protecting these women, giving them better lives. Right, because being locked in a stone tower with a horny old duke who thinks bathing is optional is basically an upgrade. It's like being told your prison cell is luxury real estate because it has a window. Number 4. Kidnapping as courtship. You think Tinder is rough? Try medieval bride kidnapping. In desperate or war-torn regions, nobles and raiding parties literally stormed peasant villages and dragged away girls by force. They called it marriage by capture, but really, it was abduction dressed up in a silk veil. One example comes from Eastern Europe and the steppes, where feudal lords and warlords raided villages for fresh wives. Families were powerless. After all, who's going to argue when an armored knight shows up with a dozen swordsmen? For the nobles, it was cheaper than negotiating dowries. For the peasants, it was like a natural disaster. One day you're feeding chickens, the next you're on a horse headed to some stranger's castle. What makes it worse is that society normalized it. Songs and stories painted these abductions as daring romances, like a medieval rom-com. Boy meets girl, boy kidnaps girl. Girl cries until she accepts her fate. The reality was more like Stockholm Syndrome in a ball gown. And once again, everyone turned a blind eye because, hey, power gets what power wants. Basically, noble courtship wasn't roses and poetry. It was more like smash and grab shopping, but with human beings. Number 5, the church's dirty blessing. Here's a plot twist. The institution that should have condemned all this, the medieval church, often looked the other way. In fact, sometimes they encouraged it. Priests and bishops were deeply tied to the noble class, and that meant turning peasant girls into noble mistresses was just another perk of power. Certain monasteries and convents quietly doubled as supply chains. Families desperate to feed themselves would hand over daughters for service, which often meant nobles got a steady pipeline of pliable, unprotected young women. And guess what? If a pregnancy happened, the church usually covered it up. Priests forged marriage records, baptized illegitimate children in secrecy, or simply erased the women's names from history altogether. The hypocrisy is almost comical. Clergy would preach chastity and morality on Sunday, then broker deals for noblemen's concubines on Monday. It was like a medieval version of HR ignoring your boss's handsy reputation. Except instead of awkward Christmas parties, it was girls sold into lifelong exploitation. The result? A system where religion didn't just fail to protect the vulnerable, it actively greased the wheels of their exploitation. Number 6, slave markets of Venice. When you think of Venice, you probably picture gondolas, masks, and overpriced gelato. But during the Middle Ages, Venice was also one of Europe's busiest hubs for the human meat market. Peasant girls from Eastern Europe, often kidnapped during raids, were dragged into Venetian slave markets, displayed like livestock, and snapped up by nobles who wanted a little extra flesh for their palaces. The girls were usually from Slavic regions. Yes, the word slave literally comes from Slav, and their fates were sealed once they hit the auction block. Rich buyers treated them as exotic pets, dressed them up, showed them off, used them however they pleased, and when the noble got bored, offloaded like second-hand furniture. The Venetian Senate tried to regulate the trade sometimes, but not because they cared about the girls. No, they just didn't want the nobility fighting over property rights. Human dignity? Never heard of her. Basically, if Venice was a romantic city, it was only for the rich. For peasant girls, it was the medieval version of a nightmare shopping mall. No way out, no refunds, and the customers were always right. Number 7, gifted to kings. Here's a gross one. Sometimes peasant girls weren't even sold for money. They were gifted to kings and nobles as tokens of loyalty. Imagine your village trying to win favor with the crown, and the solution is, hey, let's give the king our daughters. Court records across Europe and Asia show kings receiving maidens from their subjects, usually described in the most objectifying terms: young, fertile, pure, and ready for service. Spoiler: the service wasn't laundry. It was a fast track into the royal bedchamber. The logic was sickeningly simple. Offering a girl was cheaper than raising taxes, safer than rebelling, and guaranteed to flatter the noble's ego. For the girl, goodbye family, hello gilded prison. And if she resisted, her family risked punishment. That's like being told you're a birthday gift for a guy who already has 100 wives, and if you don't smile, your whole family starves. The punchline? Kings loved the gifts because it reinforced their image as godlike rulers. Nothing says divine right quite like entire villages donating their daughters. Number 8. The noble recycling system. You know how hand-me-downs work? Older sibling outgrows a shirt, so it gets passed to the younger one. Well, nobles had a similar system, but with women. When a noble got tired of a peasant mistress, she wasn't sent home. Instead, she was gifted to another lord, pawned off to a bishop, or shoved into a convent to hide the evidence of illegitimate kids. Basically, you became a medieval hand-me-down, traded around like an unwanted pair of shoes. In some regions, especially during famine years, these recycled women were even sold again, often at a discount because nobles wanted to save money. Imagine your entire worth being treated like a used car price tag. Slightly older, 1 or 2 kids, bargain deal. And the saddest part? Many of these women didn't live long enough to escape. Malnutrition, abuse, and childbirth killed them before they hit 30. So the recycling system wasn't just degrading, it was a death sentence dressed up as noble generosity. Number 9. The Ottoman harem pipeline. Everyone loves to romanticize the Ottoman harems with TV shows full of silks, jewels, and dramatic eyeliner. But let's be real. For many peasant girls, ending up in a harem was not a Cinderella story. It was human trafficking with incense. Ottoman officials and traders scoured the countryside for young women, especially from poor Christian villages in the Balkans or Caucasus. Families too broke to resist, sold their daughters, while raiders simply snatched them. The prettiest ones were shipped to Istanbul, trained in manners, music, and, of course, pleasing their masters. Some did rise to insane levels of power, like Roxolana, who went from slave girl to queen. But for every Roxolana, thousands more were discarded, abused, or forgotten the second they lost favor. The empire even had an organized system for this. Women were classified, sorted, and filtered before they ever reached the Sultan's chambers. It was basically a twisted talent show where the prize was lifelong servitude. Romantic? Only if your definition of romance includes chains, surveillance, and being locked in a palace you can never leave. Number 10. China's concubine market. Travel east to Imperial China, and guess what? Same nightmare, different dynasty. Poor families desperate for survival sold their daughters to rich households as concubines. Once purchased, the girl's fate was sealed. Endless service to her new master, rivalry with other concubines, and brutal punishments if she stepped out of line. Some concubines did rise to power, manipulating palace politics from behind the curtain. But most were little more than wombs for hire, valued for producing sons, and then tossed aside once their beauty faded. And unlike noble-born wives, these women had zero legal protection. Beating, legal. Starving, legal. Killing, technically illegal, but hey, rich men could pay off the officials. Families sometimes pretended this was an opportunity, like, look, our daughter might end up in silk instead of mud. Yeah, but at what cost? It's like selling your kid to a billionaire and hoping she gets to live in the guest house instead of the basement. For the majority, it was misery dressed up in embroidered robes. Number 11. The Indian Devadasi trap. In medieval India, one of the darkest practices was the Devadasi system, where young peasant girls were dedicated to temples. Sounds holy, right? Wrong. In reality, many of these girls were funneled straight into sexual slavery under the guise of serving the gods. Once dedicated, the girl could never marry. She belonged to the temple, which often meant being enjoyed by priests, wealthy patrons, and local nobles. Families sometimes tricked themselves into thinking this was honorable, but really, it was just another way of turning poverty into exploitation. Over time, Devadasis became the private entertainment of kings and elites, forced into dance and prostitution while cloaked in religious language. The cruelest part? Because it was framed as a sacred duty, these girls couldn't even protest. Refusing meant dishonoring their god, their family, and their community. It was the perfect trap, divine branding on top of social pressure. Basically, it was human trafficking with holy water sprinkled on top. Number 12. Russia's serf girls for the Tsar. If you thought Western Europe was bad, Tsarist Russia said, "Hold my vodka." Noble families were often expected to present young serf girls as gifts to the royal court. These girls were examined like livestock at a market. Every detail of their appearance was scrutinized. If selected, they might be pulled into the Tsar's private circle, or handed off to his powerful favorites. If rejected, back to the village in disgrace, carrying the label of being spoiled goods. Even under rulers like Catherine the Great, many noblemen kept their own hidden groups of serf women. By day, the girls labored in the fields. By night, they were summoned to the manor house. Saying no wasn't an option, serfs were considered property, and property doesn't refuse orders. Basically, it was Tinder without swipes. Just a blunt message. Congratulations, you now belong to the Duke. Number 13. France's hidden mistresses. France, the land of wine, cheese, and nobles, treating peasant girls like side quests. French kings in the 16th and 17th centuries were infamous for their secret collections of companions. The official mistresses usually came from the nobility, but behind the scenes, countless village girls were quietly funneled into the palace for private entertainment. Louis XV was especially notorious for his parc aux cerfs, a hidden residence where teenage girls, some barely past childhood, were kept for him. Families were bribed, pressured, or simply ignored, while their daughters vanished behind gilded gates. A handful enjoyed short-lived luxury, but most were discarded after a few months, left with ruined reputations and nowhere to go. The strangest part? Everyone knew, but society tolerated it. Nobles excused it as a necessary outlet for the king. Translation: royal indulgence mattered more than the lives of powerless girls. France may have invented croissants, but it also perfected the art of treating people as disposable luxuries. The forgotten graves. Here's the part nobody writes in the fairy tales. What happened after the nobles got bored? Countless peasant girls ended up dead, worn out from childbirth, beaten or abandoned without food. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories erased. You'll find them in parish registers as unmarried woman, deceased, or not at all. While the noblewomen had lavish funerals and gilded tombs, these exploited peasants were buried in unmarked graves. No songs, no monuments, just silence. The system thrived because their suffering was invisible, their voices drowned out by the grandeur of the very people who destroyed them. It's the final insult. Centuries later, we still know the names of kings and dukes who abused them, but not the women themselves. So, what do we learn from this dark carnival of exploitation? That power makes people do grotesque things, that poverty makes girls the easiest currency, and that history's fairy tales always leave out the ugly footnotes. If you're ever jealous of medieval romance, just remember, for every ball gown and castle, there were 100 peasant girls sold, stolen, or sacrificed to feed the appetites of nobles. Basically, we dodged a bullet by being born in the era of bad Tinder dates instead of wedding night barren intrusions. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.